with David Fed Chair Jay Powell reiterating that inflation has increased notably in recent months, but does remain transitory in his written testimony for his hearing tomorrow.
It's no surprise that inflation seems to be out of control. We first hear that inflation is transitory and not to worry about it, but now inflation seems to be like a new beast. With records being broken such as gas is up 50% from a year ago and eggs are up 60% despite wages only being up 5.1%. So how bad is inflation? What are the consequences? And should you be buying gold to protect yourself from hyperinflation? But the problem is everything is getting more expensive. But if inflation gets out of control, the problem is going to be much worse than just expensive eggs at Trader Joe's. I have one word for you: hyper. But first, my name is Austin. I have a degree in finance, so if you want a free stock, use my link below for Webull. I think you can get up to $9,000 of Apple stock. Okay, back to it. Hyperinflation. So hyperinflation is defined as monetary inflation occurring at a very high rate. I know, super descriptive. But hyperinflation has led to depressions, famines, and even a collapse of entire countries. So the consequences for leaving inflation unchecked would be absolutely catastrophic. In fact, a hedge fund manager said that inflation now could lead to a global societal collapse. So is this the track we are headed down? We have to ask ourselves, what is inflation? Well, Investopia says inflation is the rate at which prices for goods and services rise. And yeah, that's pretty obvious. But let me explain it in simple terms. When the amount of dollars outnumbers the amount of supply, that's when the supply side of things can start charging higher prices. And these higher prices basically equal inflation. So what are the consequences? Well, I have 3.5 of them for you, and all these could lead to the impending hyperinflation doom. Number 1, less purchasing power. Low-income households are most hurt by inflation. Low income have less discretionary income and are essentially living paycheck to paycheck. In fact, CNBC found that 64% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. So their loss of purchasing power is what's really hurting the families the most. Less purchasing power means less money for discretionary spending, such as going to restaurants, going on vacation, or going out to the movie. Instead, they have to use their money to pay for necessities such as gas and groceries. But even that isn't easy, since groceries like meat, poultry, fish, and eggs are 13% higher since 2021. And just in the last 3 years, what would cost $85 in 2020 now cost $100 in 2023. So low-income families can only do so much to reduce their monthly spending. You can buy cheap toilet paper and switch to chicken and rice, but that can only go so far. And that's why in most cities, if you look at evictions, they are increasing steadily over the course since we entered the pandemic in 2020, almost at the same rate as inflation. Number 2, less savings. Like mentioned before, people have less extra money, so they naturally have less money to save. In June, Forbes ran a survey and found that 42% of respondents say that they are saving less. And according to the Federal Reserve, Americans are only saving 2.4% of their income instead of the 30% normally saved during years before the pandemic. This is indicating that Americans are struggling to keep up with the rapidly rising increases in price. And then Americans are turning to credit cards and cashing out of their retirement just to pay for an unexpected large expense, such as a car breakdown. Number 3, loss of business. So like I was just saying, businesses get severely hurt during high inflation period. People will still spend money on food, but they will give up on other things like going to a local coffee shop and settling for a McDonald's cup of Joe instead. Or maybe you decide it's no longer in the financial budget to go to Wednesday pizza night with the family. Well, now that coffee shop or pizza place, they are also getting less income and they still have the rising cost. An interesting news report from Cabbage found that during the pandemic, small businesses' revenue actually grew by a whopping 87%. But during that same period, their profits remain the same. And this is essentially because business costs have been going up along with the competitive workforce, resulting in businesses having to spend more money to get the adequate talent they need to run efficiently. So basically, the business input costs have risen at a faster rate than the revenue has grown. And I think this will result in businesses slowly beginning to lose their money and even fail. CBS News shows us that business bankruptcies are already on the rise, and they're up 31% just in 2022. All this will send more businesses out of business, and it'll take more jobs off of the job market. While this all sounds bad, and it is, don't get me wrong, inflation has a history of devastating countries in the past. Like, it's so bad that countries have literally fallen from just hyperinflation. So first up, let's take a look at Hungary. After World War II, Hungary went into what is called a supply shock. Basically, the war naturally caused caused a rapid decrease in their supplies, but the money supply stayed constant. The amount of money in the economy was much higher than the amount of supply, and that's when inflation just started to take off. With the lack of supply and plentiful amount of money, insane prices were being asked, resulting in hyperinflation. In fact, the daily percentage was 207%, and prices for goods were nearly doubling every 15 hours. Then that brings us to Zimbabwe. See, during the 2008 crisis, Zimbabwe had their own crisis similar to the US inflationary scenario we're experiencing right now. The Zimbabwe government was printing too much money, sending the country into hyperinflation. At one point, the daily inflation rate was 98%, and prices were doubling every 24.7 hours. But then moving on to the Soviet Union, in the 90s, Yugoslavia hit a daily inflation rate of 64%. So you can see why it's important to pay attention to history, and luckily, the Fed is doing the same thing. They are paying a close attention to history as well as current events right now. So the solution for our problems comes at the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve controls the interest rates of the economy, and think of the interest rates as a gas pedal for the economy. When the economy is in a good place with no inflation, the Fed can have low rates, which means pedal to the metal, and then the economy expands. Well, right now the economy needs to slow down, so they need to raise rates, which slows down the economy and inflation down as well. And the Fed is doing this, and the Fed is doing this at a record pace, in fact, with the last increase of 25 basis points, bringing the Fed's rate to just around 5%. Bringing us right around the same levels as we were during the late 2000s. And really, this can be the only solution, or only good solution. But good news, it is finally starting to work, and it does come at some cost though. And number one reason, it makes the cost of borrowing go up. Credit cards get more expensive, car loans get more expensive, and mortgages hit the hearts. Prospective buyers have lost so much buying power out of everyone else. In December of 2020, mortgages were at a historically low rate, with an average interest rate of 2.6%. So if you take the average household income of $70,000 and $20,000 down, you could afford $323,000. But comparing that to today, where the mortgage rate is 7.25% and all the other numbers are the same, you could only afford $227,000, nearly a $100,000 decrease over the span of a couple of years. So we're currently in this exact boat, and we would love to buy a home, but it just doesn't make as much sense considering that interest rates have increased and our buying power has greatly dropped, and now we can only afford homes in areas that we really don't like. So yes, the interest rates, they do really hurt, and if we don't think we can afford inflation now, we definitely can't afford a hyperinflation scenario that would completely ruin the dollar and probably most things that you know and love. Instead of increasing the size of our economy, we will be increasing interest rates, and that will be reducing the size of our economy. The ultimate goal is to bring inflation down to the target percentage that the Federal Reserve has set at 2%. And during the peak period, we were as high as 9.1%. So here are my thoughts. First of all, I don't think there's a good enough reason to be concerned about hyperinflation, to be honest. The governments that had originally gone down caused the hyperinflation themselves, and they were doing a lot of things wrong. Instead of shrinking the money supply, they were actually increasing the money supply, and the Federal Reserve right now seems to be on the right track. They're actually shrinking our own money supply. Inflation is already coming down from the peak period of June at 9.1% to around 6.4% right now. So there's no reason to panic and liquidate your nest egg into gold. Instead, maybe consider something like a money market fund to help protect your nest egg from high inflation. So I think inflation is on the decline, which is good news, but unfortunately, this will most likely lead us into a recession. So to stay in the loop, please subscribe, and if the video was helpful at all, please smash the like button. The more people it can reach, the more people it can help. So thank you so much for coming, and I'll see you in the next one.